"Mr. Reed, you are not a party to this case. Leave the courtroom immediately." The words struck the room with the clean finality of a judge's gavel, and for a heartbeat, every whispered conversation inside courtroom 5B of the Franklin County Courthouse in Columbus, Ohio, simply disappeared. Marcus Reed stood near the rear benches with a large brown envelope tucked carefully beneath one arm, his navy work jacket still carrying the faint scent of diesel and the cool November air. At 42, he had learned long ago that raising his voice rarely changed another person's mind, so he simply nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor," he answered quietly. His tone carried neither resentment nor fear, only respect. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked down from the bench, her expression composed behind silver-framed reading glasses. She had spent more than 3 decades presiding over difficult cases, and today's proceeding had already slipped behind schedule. The homicide trial before her had drawn local reporters, anxious family members, and a crowded gallery after nearly 8 months of conflicting testimony. Procedure mattered. Order mattered. A stranger approaching the clerk's desk during active proceedings did not. "Bailiff," she said evenly, "please escort Mr. Reed outside." The uniformed bailiff stepped forward without hostility. "Sir, this way, please." Marcus offered a faint smile. Of course. He made no attempt to argue. He simply glanced toward the defense table where attorney Olivia Carter met his eyes for the briefest second. She looked puzzled. They had spoken only once by telephone the previous evening after Marcus called her office insisting that something intended for the court had finally reached him. She had assumed he meant paperwork that could wait until recess. Now she wondered if she had dismissed him too quickly. Across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Daniel Brooks barely looked up from his trial notebook. Another interruption, he thought. Another citizen convinced they held the missing piece that would change everything. It happened more often than television ever admitted. Judge Whitmore reached for the next exhibit while Marcus turned toward the aisle. As he walked, the envelope remained tucked securely beneath his arm, its corner marked with a small red stamp reading Final Supplemental Material. The clerk noticed it. So did Olivia. Neither said a word before the courtroom doors opened and closed behind Marcus with a soft hydraulic sigh. Outside, the hallway felt cooler. Marble floors reflected rows of fluorescent lights while attorneys hurried between courtrooms carrying legal folders and paper coffee cups. The bailiff stopped beside the security station. "Nothing personal," he said. "Judge likes to keep things by the book." Marcus nodded. "I understand." He carefully removed the envelope from beneath his arm and looked at the handwritten delivery receipt clipped to the front. It listed the case number correctly, the receiving office, the filing date. Everything matched. "Would you mind doing me one favor?" Marcus asked. "If the judge decides she wants it later, would you make sure she gets this?" The bailiff hesitated. "I can leave it with the clerk. That's all I'm asking." Marcus handed it over with both hands, almost reluctantly, as though letting go of something heavier than paper. "It belongs to the court." The bailiff accepted it and carried it back through the courtroom door without another question. Marcus remained alone in the hallway, settling onto a wooden bench beneath a framed photograph of the Ohio Supreme Court building. He folded his hands and waited without checking his phone, without pacing, without complaint. Inside courtroom 5B, testimony resumed exactly as planned. Yet twice within the next several minutes, Judge Whitmore's eyes drifted almost unconsciously toward the unopened brown envelope now resting beside the clerk's files. She told herself it could wait until recess. Even so, she found herself wondering why a city bus driver had crossed half of Columbus on his day off simply to place that envelope into the court's hands. Before we continue, if you enjoy powerful stories that reveal the strength of the human spirit and the choices that shape our lives, subscribe to Narralight. Every story has a lesson, every choice has a consequence, and sometimes the smallest moment changes everything. Now, let's see what happens next. Marcus Reed remained seated on the wooden bench outside courtroom 5B while courthouse employees passed through the hallway, carrying stacks of files and insulated coffee mugs. He did not look impatient. Years behind the wheel of a city bus had taught him that schedules changed, people became frustrated, and the calmest person in the room usually saw the most. He rested his hands together and quietly watched the digital clock above the security station advance minute by minute. Inside the courtroom, Testimony resumed with Detective Harold Simmons returning to the witness stand. Assistant District Attorney Daniel Brooks guided him through a familiar sequence of questions about timelines, surveillance footage, and witness interviews. The answers sounded organized, almost rehearsed after months of preparation, yet something felt different to Olivia Carter. She kept thinking about the envelope Marcus had carried with such care. More importantly, she remembered his voice from the previous evening. He had never claimed to know who committed the crime. He had only repeated one sentence twice. The court needs to see everything before reaching the end. At the time, she assumed he was exaggerating. Now she was no longer certain. Judge Eleanor Whitmore listened carefully while taking occasional handwritten notes. Her reputation had been built on patience rather than speed, but today she found herself distracted in ways she rarely experienced. Every few minutes her eyes drifted toward the clerk's desk, where the large brown envelope rested beneath a case file. The red stamp remained visible. Final supplemental material. It was unusual. Court records normally arrived through electronic filing or established legal channels, not through a city bus driver walking into an active proceeding. Yet the delivery receipt attached to the front appeared authentic. During a brief pause in testimony, she leaned slightly toward the courtroom clerk. "Has that item been logged?" she asked quietly. The clerk nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. It was delivered this morning through the records office. The chain of custody paperwork is attached. Has either party reviewed it?" "No, Your Honor. It arrived after this morning's evidence conference." Judge Whitmore looked back toward the witness stand without replying. The answer settled uneasily in her thoughts. She had ordered Marcus to leave because maintaining courtroom procedure mattered. That decision still felt correct. Yet the envelope itself had entered the building through proper channels. Outside, Marcus noticed Olivia Carter step into the hallway during a short recess. She walked toward him with measured steps, carrying a legal pad against her side. "Mr. Reed," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I should have asked more questions yesterday." Marcus offered a polite smile. "You were busy doing your job. What exactly is inside that envelope?" He shook his head gently. "I have not opened it. It was sealed before it reached me." Olivia frowned. "Then how do you know it matters?" Marcus looked through the courthouse window toward the parking lot where a white Columbus City bus rolled past on its afternoon route. "Because the woman who handed it to me told me she had spent 3 months trying to make sure it reached the right courtroom. She asked me not to read it. She only asked me to deliver it exactly where the case number said it belonged." Olivia studied his face. There was no excitement in his voice, no attempt to make himself sound important. Only quiet certainty. Who was she? Marcus lowered his eyes for a moment. "I think that is something the envelope can answer better than I can." Before Olivia could ask another question, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. "Counsel, we are back on the record." She nodded and returned inside. Marcus remained on the bench exactly where he had been, watching another minute disappear from the courthouse clock. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore thanked the detective for his testimony. Then, almost without realizing why, her hand moved toward the unopened envelope once again. Judge Eleanor Whitmore rested her fingertips lightly on the edge of the brown envelope while the attorneys organized their notes after the detective stepped down from the witness stand. Nothing in the courtroom had changed, yet everything felt slightly different. The seal remained intact. The chain of custody form clipped to the front showed that the package had entered the courthouse through the official records office shortly after 8:30 that morning. Every signature appeared complete. Every date matched the case file. She looked toward the clerk once more. "Please confirm that no copies have been distributed." The clerk reviewed the attached paperwork before answering. "That is correct, Your Honor. The contents have not been opened by the court or by either party." Daniel Brooks rose from the prosecution table. "Your Honor, unless this material has already been admitted through discovery, I would ask the court to continue with today's schedule." Olivia Carter stood a moment later. "Your Honor, before the court rules on that request, I believe it would be appropriate to determine whether the material is relevant. We know it entered the courthouse through proper procedure." Brooks replied calmly. "Relevance does not eliminate procedural requirements." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Counsel, both of you make fair points." Her voice remained steady, but her attention lingered on the envelope. "The court will first determine the nature of the submission before deciding whether it may become part of these proceedings." The gallery fell silent again. A reporter quietly lowered a notebook, sensing that something unexpected might happen. Judge Whitmore carefully examined the outside of the envelope without breaking the seal. The return label listed the Franklin County Records Archive. Beneath it was a handwritten notation referencing a supplemental evidence inventory completed nearly 4 months earlier. The handwriting was neat but unfamiliar. She turned to the clerk. Was there an administrative correction filed in this matter? The clerk searched the electronic docket. There was one supplemental inventory entry, Your Honor, but it was marked as pending verification after a transfer between storage facilities. Olivia's eyes narrowed. She remembered reviewing hundreds of pages of discovery. She did not remember seeing any completed follow-up concerning that inventory. Across the room, Daniel Brooks opened his own copy of the docket and quietly searched for the same notation. His expression changed only slightly when he located the reference. It had been there all along, buried among routine administrative filings that no one considered significant because nothing indicated additional evidence had actually arrived. Outside the courtroom, Marcus remained seated exactly where he had been. An elderly maintenance employee pushing a cleaning cart recognized him from a downtown bus route. "Long day?" the man asked with a friendly smile. Marcus returned the smile. "It is an important day for someone." "Yours?" Marcus looked toward the closed courtroom doors. "Maybe not. Maybe someone else's." The maintenance employee nodded without pressing further and continued down the hallway. Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and removed a folded bus schedule, absent-mindedly smoothing its edges before placing it back. Waiting had become part of his profession long before this morning. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore finally placed both hands flat upon the bench. "The court will take a brief recess of 15 minutes. During that time, I will review the filing history associated with this submission before making any further procedural ruling." The gavel sounded once. Attorneys gathered their files. Reporters hurried into the hallway to make phone calls. Olivia glanced toward the courtroom doors, wondering whether Marcus had known far more than he had ever claimed. Meanwhile, Judge Whitmore carried the unopened envelope into her chambers, unaware that the administrative record she was about to review would answer one question while raising an even larger one. Judge Eleanor Whitmore closed the door to her chambers and placed the sealed brown envelope on the corner of her desk without touching the clasp. Instead, she sat before her computer and opened the electronic docket associated with the case. The supplemental inventory entry appeared exactly where the courtroom clerk had described it, buried between routine scheduling notices and administrative transfers. Nothing about the entry looked dramatic. In fact, that was what bothered her. It was ordinary enough to be ignored. She clicked through the filing history one document at a time, tracing the chain from the county evidence warehouse to the records archive. Every transfer contained initials. Every transfer contained a date. Then she noticed something unusual. One signature line remained blank on the final transfer receipt, followed by a notation stating that physical delivery to the assigned courtroom was pending. The envelope on her desk appeared to be the missing delivery. She leaned back in her chair, thoughtful rather than alarmed. The procedure had not failed completely. It had simply stopped halfway. Meanwhile, in the hallway, Olivia Carter approached Marcus Reed again. This time, she carried a printed copy of the docket. She sat on the opposite end of the wooden bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. "I found the inventory reference," she said quietly. Marcus nodded once. "I thought you would. You never told me the woman who gave you the envelope worked with court records." "Because she never said she did," Marcus replied. "She only asked whether I drove Route 12 on Tuesdays." Olivia looked puzzled. Marcus continued. "She boarded my bus 3 weeks ago carrying a storage box. We started talking because she looked worried. 2 days later, she wrote again. That was when she told me a document had been misplaced during an evidence transfer. Last Friday, she handed me the envelope after confirming the case number and asked whether I could bring it here on my day off if she was unavailable. She said the records office would process the paperwork first thing Monday morning." Olivia studied him carefully. "You barely knew her." "That is true. Yet you agreed." Marcus smiled faintly. "Sometimes helping someone only requires showing up." His answer stayed with Olivia long after the courtroom doors reopened. Back inside, Daniel Brooks reviewed the discovery index for a second time. The supplemental inventory was listed, but no description of its contents appeared anywhere in the prosecution file. That meant one of two things. Either the package contained administrative material with no evidentiary value, or it had never completed the filing process. Neither possibility justified assumptions. When Judge Whitmore returned to the bench, her expression remained composed, although her decision now carried greater weight than before. She addressed both attorneys evenly. The court has confirmed that the envelope presently before us entered the judicial records system through documented administrative procedure. However, its contents have not yet been reviewed by the court or disclosed to either party. She paused briefly before continuing. The court must balance procedural fairness with the obligation to ensure that all properly submitted material is handled according to law. Daniel Brooks stood. Your Honor, the state requests an opportunity to review any newly disclosed material before further testimony continues. That request is noted, Judge Whitmore replied. Olivia Carter rose next. The defense joins that request. Judge Whitmore nodded. Both requests are reasonable. She rested one hand lightly on the unopened envelope. For the first time since the morning session began, she no longer viewed it as an interruption. She viewed it as an unanswered procedural responsibility. Yet one question continued to trouble her. If this package had traveled through official channels all along, why had the woman who entrusted it to Marcus Reed believed that asking a city bus driver to complete the final delivery offered the best chance of ensuring it finally reached the courtroom where it belonged? The courtroom settled into an uneasy silence as Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked from the sealed envelope to the attorneys standing before her. She understood that every decision from this point forward had to protect both fairness and procedure. Neither side could be surprised by evidence that had not been properly reviewed, yet the court also carried a responsibility to acknowledge material that had entered the official record through legitimate administrative channels. She folded her hands for a brief moment before speaking. The court will not open this envelope in the presence of the jury. First, both parties will be given an opportunity to examine whatever is inside under the rules of disclosure. The question before us is not whether the material favors one side or the other. The question is whether justice requires that it be considered. Daniel Brooks nodded respectfully. The state appreciates the court's approach, Your Honor. Olivia Carter answered just as calmly. The defense agrees. Neither attorney attempted to gain an advantage. Both understood that the credibility of the proceeding depended upon following the same rules that governed every other criminal trial. Judge Whitmore turned toward the clerk. Please verify once more that the chain of custody documents attached to this envelope remain complete. The clerk carefully reviewed each page before responding. Yes, Your Honor. Every transfer is documented except for the final hand delivery to this courtroom, which was completed today. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the courtroom doors. For the first time that afternoon, she found herself thinking less about the envelope and more about the man who had carried it. Marcus Reed had not demanded attention. He had not interrupted testimony after being instructed to stop. He had not argued when asked to leave. He had simply delivered what he believed belonged before the court and accepted the consequences without complaint. That quiet discipline now seemed more significant than it had only an hour earlier. Outside, Marcus remained seated beneath the framed photograph overlooking the hallway. His phone vibrated gently in his pocket. It was a text message from his 17-year-old daughter, Naomi. Dad, everything okay? Are you still at the courthouse? Marcus smiled before typing a short reply. Everything is fine. I might be a little late getting home. Eat dinner without me if you get hungry. A moment later, another message appeared. Be careful driving back. Marcus slipped the phone into his pocket, grateful for the ordinary exchange. It reminded him why he had never regretted teaching his daughter that keeping a promise mattered even when nobody noticed. Nearby, the same maintenance employee rolled his cart back through the corridor. Still waiting? He asked with an easy grin. Marcus nodded. Sometimes that is part of finishing the job. The man chuckled softly and continued toward the elevators. Back inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore addressed the attorneys again. Before this matter proceeds, I would like the records supervisor who processed today's administrative transfer to be contacted. The court needs clarification regarding the delayed delivery. The clerk immediately began making the necessary call. Daniel Brooks quietly closed his trial notebook. Olivia Carter did the same. Neither lawyer objected. They both recognized that understanding how the envelope reached the courtroom could become just as important as whatever might eventually be found inside it. As the courtroom settled once more, Judge Whitmore rested her hand lightly against the sealed package without breaking the clasp. The envelope had answered one question already. It had arrived through lawful procedure. Yet another question now stood before everyone in the room. Who was the records employee who had trusted an ordinary city bus driver to complete the final step? And what had convinced her that the document was important enough to keep trying until it finally reached the judge's bench? The courtroom remained in recess, but no one wandered very far. Reporters stood quietly near the back wall, speaking in low voices instead of rushing outside. Even they sensed that the afternoon had taken an unexpected turn, not because of a dramatic revelation, but because a routine administrative detail refused to stay routine. Judge Eleanor Whitmore reviewed the latest note handed to her by the courtroom clerk. "Your Honor," the clerk said, "the records supervisor is available by telephone now. She is prepared to answer procedural questions under the record." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Please place the call on the secure conference line." Within moments, the speaker on the clerk's desk came alive. "This is Linda Alvarez, Franklin County Records Archive." Her voice sounded professional, calm, and slightly tired. Judge Whitmore introduced herself before asking the first question. "Ms. Alvarez, I am attempting to verify the administrative history of a supplemental filing associated with the current trial. Can you explain why physical delivery remained pending until today?" There was a brief pause before the answer came. "Yes, Your Honor. The filing was transferred correctly from storage to our archive. During routine verification, we discovered that one supporting inventory sheet referenced a sealed enclosure that had never been physically matched with the rest of the file. We delayed release until the enclosure could be located." Daniel Brooks listened carefully without interrupting. Olivia Carter leaned forward slightly, writing every sentence. "When was it located?" Judge Whitmore asked. "Last Friday afternoon," Linda replied. The enclosure had been placed inside another evidence transfer container during an office relocation several months earlier. Once we confirmed the identifying numbers matched, we completed the remaining paperwork. Judge Whitmore glanced toward the envelope resting on the bench. "Why was it not delivered directly by court staff this morning?" Linda answered without hesitation. "It was scheduled for delivery. Unfortunately, the employee assigned to transport archived materials experienced a medical emergency before leaving the office. We were operating with reduced personnel." The explanation sounded entirely ordinary, and that was precisely what made it believable. Olivia looked toward Marcus through the narrow window in the courtroom door. His presence no longer seemed accidental. It seemed practical. Judge Whitmore continued. "How did Mr. Marcus Reed become involved?" Linda's tone softened. "One of our temporary archive assistants recognized him from a city bus route she rides every week. She knew he had already planned to be downtown on his scheduled day off because he had mentioned jury duty months earlier during casual conversation. After the package completed official intake this morning, she asked whether he would be willing to carry it from the records office to the courthouse clerk's counter. He agreed, but only after confirming that all paperwork had been processed." Olivia slowly lowered her pen. Every answer removed another layer of uncertainty. Marcus had never bypassed procedure. He had followed it. Daniel Brooks finally spoke. "Your Honor, based upon that explanation, I no longer question how the envelope reached the court. My concern remains limited to its legal relevance." "As does mine," Olivia added. Judge Whitmore thanked Linda Alvarez for her assistance before ending the call. The courtroom settled once again into thoughtful silence. Outside, Marcus remained unaware of the conversation that had just taken place. He was looking through the courthouse window as another city bus stopped across the street to pick up afternoon passengers beginning their trip home. He checked his watch, then smiled quietly to himself. Someone else would be driving his usual route today. For once, arriving late did not trouble him. Inside the courtroom, Judge Whitmore rested both hands on the bench and looked at the sealed envelope with renewed clarity. Every procedural question surrounding its arrival had now been answered. Only one question remained, and it was the one that mattered most. After months of careful investigation, what information inside that sealed package had been important enough to survive transfers, delays, office relocations, and weeks of determined effort until it finally reached the courtroom where it had always belonged? Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked across the courtroom before speaking, allowing the quiet to settle naturally instead of forcing the next step. The record will reflect that the court has confirmed the administrative history of the supplemental filing, she said. Counsel approached the bench. Daniel Brooks and Olivia Carter gathered their legal pads and met before the bench while the jury remained outside the courtroom, still waiting in the jury assembly room under the supervision of the bailiff. Every procedural safeguard remained intact. Judge Whitmore rested one hand on the sealed envelope. Neither side has reviewed these materials, she said. I intend to open the package outside the presence of the jury. Both parties will examine the contents simultaneously. If the material has evidentiary value, the court will determine the appropriate legal procedure before anything is presented during trial. Both attorneys agreed without hesitation. No one wanted a shortcut. No one wanted an avoidable appeal. The seal was photographed by the clerk, the case number was verified aloud for the record, and the envelope was carefully placed on a side evidence table where every movement could be documented. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed noticed the bailiff step into the hallway. The officer walked directly toward him, no longer carrying the reserved expression from earlier. Mr. Reed, he said politely, the court is not calling you back yet, but Judge Whitmore has asked that you remain available this afternoon. Marcus stood immediately. I will be here. There is a conference room across the hall if you would be more comfortable. Marcus smiled gently. The bench is fine. Thank you. The bailiff nodded before returning inside. Marcus sat once more, folded his hands, and watched afternoon sunlight stretch across the marble floor near the courthouse entrance. He thought about the woman who had trusted him with the envelope. She had seemed relieved when he accepted it, but before leaving, she had said one sentence that still echoed in his memory. Sometimes paperwork gets lost because everyone assumes someone else already handled it. At the time, Marcus believed she was talking about office mistakes. Now he wondered whether she had meant something deeper. Inside the courtroom, the clerk carefully cut the evidence tape without damaging the envelope itself. Judge Whitmore deliberately avoided looking inside first. Instead, she instructed the clerk to remove the contents one item at a time while both attorneys observed. The first item was a sealed evidence inventory sheet bearing the same case number already before the court. The second was a compact disc inside an evidence sleeve with an official archive label. The third was a certified transcript accompanied by a notarized verification page dated nearly 4 months earlier. Olivia immediately recognized that the documents were older than many of the later filings already introduced during trial. Daniel quietly adjusted his glasses, reading the certification before saying a single word. None of the material appeared dramatic at first glance. It looked administrative, organized, and professionally prepared. Yet every page referenced the same exhibit number that had been discussed repeatedly throughout the trial, but never physically produced. Judge Whitmore felt the weight of that realization settle slowly rather than all at once. Counsel, she said evenly, have either of you ever received these documents through discovery? Daniel answered first. No, Your Honor. Olivia looked through several pages before giving the same response. Neither has the defense. The courtroom remained silent except for the soft sound of paper turning. The missing material had not introduced a surprise witness or an extraordinary confession. Instead, it introduced something potentially more significant, an official record that everyone had assumed already existed in someone else's file. Judge Whitmore looked toward the closed courtroom doors leading to the hallway, where Marcus continued waiting without knowing what had just been found. For the second time that day, she realized that the quietest person connected to this case had unknowingly protected the one piece of the process that no one else had noticed was incomplete. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained standing beside the evidence table while the clerk carefully arranged the newly discovered materials in the order listed on the inventory sheet. No one hurried. Every document was photographed, logged, and assigned a temporary exhibit marker before either attorney was permitted to examine it. The process was methodical because it had to be. Every action taken inside the courtroom could one day be reviewed by another court, and Judge Whitmore intended the record to reflect patience rather than assumption. Daniel Brooks lifted the certified transcript first. He scanned several pages before stopping at a paragraph that caused his expression to tighten. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he handed the transcript to Olivia Carter. She read the same section twice before looking back toward the judge. Your Honor, she said carefully, This appears to be a verbatim transcription of an interview conducted during the early stages of the investigation. Judge Whitmore nodded slightly. Was that interview disclosed during discovery? Olivia answered without looking away from the page. Not in this form. Daniel spoke next. The witness was identified in investigative summaries, but I have never seen a certified transcript attached to the case file. The distinction mattered. A summary reflected someone else's interpretation. A certified transcript preserved every question and every answer exactly as spoken. The clerk then opened the evidence sleeve containing the compact disc. Attached to it was a printed verification form explaining that the recording represented the original audio from the same interview referenced in the transcript. The chain of custody showed matching evidence numbers, matching dates, and matching archive seals. Nothing suggested tampering. Nothing suggested misconduct. Instead, the paperwork suggested something far more ordinary and therefore more believable. During the movement of records between storage locations months earlier, one complete section of properly documented material had simply become separated from the primary file before eventually being recovered through a routine inventory review. Judge Whitmore looked toward both attorneys. The court is not drawing conclusions regarding the contents, she said. However, the existence of original source material that neither party has previously reviewed requires careful consideration. Both lawyers agreed. Neither attempted to argue for immediate admission. They understood that fairness demanded equal access before either side could address the significance of the documents. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed remained seated on the same wooden bench. The courthouse had grown quieter as the afternoon progressed. Most visitors had already finished their business and left the building, leaving only attorneys, court employees, and the occasional family member waiting patiently in the hallway. Marcus noticed a young law student carrying a stack of casebooks struggle to open a heavy door while balancing a cardboard tray of coffee. Without saying anything, he stood, opened the door, and smiled politely as she passed. "Thank you," she said. "You are welcome," Marcus replied before returning to the bench. The small exchange disappeared as quickly as it happened, unnoticed by nearly everyone except the bailiff, who quietly observed the moment from across the hall. Inside the courtroom, Olivia reached the final page of the transcript and slowly lowered it onto the evidence table. She looked toward Daniel Brooks, who appeared equally thoughtful. "Your Honor," she said, "before the jury returns, I believe both parties need additional time to compare this transcript with the testimony already presented during trial." Daniel nodded in agreement. "The state joins that request." Judge Whitmore rested her hand lightly on the certified transcript rather than the envelope that had carried it. Earlier that day, the unanswered question had been whether the package belonged before the court. That question had now been resolved. A more difficult question had taken its place. If the exact words preserved inside this transcript differed in meaningful ways from the testimony the jury had already heard, what responsibility did the court now have to ensure that the search for truth remained fair to everyone involved? Before we continue, if you enjoy inspiring stories about courage, second chances, and people who choose kindness when it matters most, subscribe to Narralight. Our stories remind us that one decision, one voice, or one act of compassion can change a life forever. Now, let's see what happened next. Judge Eleanor Whitmore instructed the clerk to prepare duplicate copies of the certified transcript for both parties while the original remained secured on the evidence table. Every page was numbered, every transfer documented, and every signature recorded before anyone continued reading. She understood that confidence in the judicial process depended as much on careful procedure as it did on the facts themselves. "The jury will remain outside until the court determines the appropriate course," she said. "No reference to these materials will be made in their presence until both parties have had a fair opportunity to review them." Daniel Brooks quietly compared the transcript against the investigative summary already contained in his trial notebook. At first the differences appeared minor. Then he noticed that several answers contained in the certified transcript had been condensed into a single sentence in the summary. The summary was not inaccurate, but it lacked important context. Olivia Carter reached the same conclusion from the opposite side of the courtroom. She marked several passages with removable tabs before looking toward the judge. "Your Honor, I am not suggesting misconduct," she said carefully. "However, Context may influence how portions of previous testimony are understood. Daniel nodded before responding. The state agrees that the original language deserves careful examination. Neither attorney sounded defensive. Instead, both recognized that the newly recovered record might require the court to revisit assumptions that had formed gradually over months of litigation rather than through any single mistake. Judge Whitmore appreciated their restraint. It reinforced her belief that justice depended not upon winning quickly, but upon reaching reliable conclusions through a transparent process. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed remained seated near the window overlooking the courthouse plaza. The late afternoon sun reflected softly across parked cars and city buses moving through downtown Columbus. His phone buzzed once more. Naomi had sent another message. "Do you know when you will be home?" Marcus smiled before replying. "Not yet, but I promised I would finish what I came here to do." He slipped the phone back into his pocket and looked toward the courtroom doors without expectation. He had delivered the envelope exactly as promised. Everything else now belonged to the court. Across the hallway, the bailiff watched Marcus for a moment before approaching with 2 paper cups. "Coffee?" he asked. Marcus accepted one with quiet gratitude. "Thank you." The bailiff leaned lightly against the wall. "You have been waiting here for hours." Marcus looked down at the warm cup in his hands. "Some things are worth waiting for." The officer nodded thoughtfully. Earlier that day, he had seen only an unexpected visitor interrupting a busy trial. Now he saw a man who had asked for nothing beyond the opportunity to complete a promise. Inside the courtroom, Olivia reached the final section of the certified transcript. One exchange immediately caught her attention because it referred to the same exhibit number that appeared on the compact disc recovered inside the envelope. She looked toward Daniel. "Have you reached page 43? Daniel turned another page before stopping. His expression became noticeably more serious. "Yes." Judge Whitmore observed both attorneys carefully. "Without discussing the substance on the record at this time, can either side state whether the recovered materials appear potentially relevant?" Daniel answered first. "Yes, Your Honor." Olivia gave the same answer a moment later. "The defense also believes they may be relevant." Judge Whitmore rested her hands on the bench and looked briefly toward the closed courtroom doors. Earlier that afternoon, she had believed the interruption came from a stranger carrying an inconvenient package. Now the court possessed an officially recovered record that neither side had previously examined in its complete form. The envelope itself was no longer the mystery. The greater question had become whether the original words preserved inside the transcript would require the court to reconsider testimony that everyone had accepted without ever hearing the complete conversation. The atmosphere inside courtroom 5B shifted almost imperceptibly. No one spoke above a conversational tone, yet every person present understood that the afternoon had entered a different phase. Judge Eleanor Whitmore closed the certified transcript and looked first to Daniel Brooks, then to Olivia Carter. "The court has now confirmed that both parties have received identical copies of the recovered materials," she said. "Before we determine the appropriate legal procedure, I will hear each side regarding whether additional review is necessary." Daniel rose first. "Your Honor, after comparing the certified transcript with the investigative summaries previously disclosed, the state believes additional review is appropriate. The summaries accurately reflected the general substance of the interview, but they do not preserve every question and answer in its original context." Olivia stood after him. "The defense agrees. Context is especially important where credibility may be affected, even if the underlying facts remain consistent." Judge Whitmore appreciated that neither attorney attempted to overstate the issue. Both recognized that a criminal trial demanded precision rather than dramatic conclusions. She turned toward the clerk. "Please note that the court is not making any finding regarding the weight or admissibility of these materials today. We are addressing procedure before substance." The clerk recorded every word. The record mattered because every decision could later be reviewed if necessary. Daniel opened the certified transcript once again. This time he focused on the questions rather than the answers. He noticed that the interviewer had repeatedly asked the witness to distinguish between direct observations and assumptions. Those distinctions appeared only briefly in the investigative summary. Olivia reached the same section from her copy and quietly underlined several exchanges. The witness had answered carefully, often explaining what could be confirmed and what could not. Nothing in the transcript suggested dishonesty. Instead, it reflected a level of caution that had been softened by later summaries prepared for administrative efficiency. "Your Honor," Daniel said after several minutes, "I believe both parties should compare the original audio recording with the certified transcript before asking the court for any ruling." Olivia nodded. The defense joins that request. Judge Whitmore considered the proposal before answering. "That is a reasonable request. The court will provide the necessary equipment and chambers so that both parties may review the recording together under supervision." Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed remained seated near the window as daylight slowly faded across the courthouse plaza. The city traffic had begun its evening rhythm. Buses arrived, paused, and continued through downtown exactly on schedule. Marcus watched one of them disappear around the corner and smiled quietly, knowing another driver was covering his route. His phone remained silent now. He had already told Naomi he would return home as soon as his responsibility ended. The bailiff stepped into the hallway once more. "Mr. Reed," he said with a respectful tone that differed noticeably from earlier that afternoon, "the court appreciates your patience." Marcus inclined his head. "Thank you. You may be asked to remain a little longer." "That is all right." The bailiff hesitated before adding, "You handled today with remarkable grace." Marcus looked toward the courtroom doors. "Everyone inside is trying to do the right thing. Sometimes that simply takes time." The officer reflected on those words as he returned inside. They carried no bitterness despite the morning's misunderstanding. Back in chambers, the original audio recording was prepared for playback. The clerk documented the evidence number before inserting the disc into the court's media system. Neither attorney spoke while the recording loaded. Judge Whitmore watched quietly from the end of the conference table. Earlier in the day, she believed the missing envelope represented an interruption to an orderly trial. Now she understood that it represented something entirely different. A reminder that careful institutions remain trustworthy only when they are willing to examine overlooked details with the same discipline they apply to every visible one. As the recording's opening tones sounded through the speakers, everyone in the room understood that they were about to hear the witness's exact words for the very first time, and those words might answer one lingering question while raising another that no one had yet considered. The first voice emerged from the courtroom speakers with the faint background hum typical of a recorded interview conducted inside a government office. No one around the conference table interrupted. Daniel Brooks followed the certified transcript line by line, while Olivia Carter did the same from her copy. Every pause, every question, and every carefully chosen answer matched the written record exactly. Judge Eleanor Whitmore remained silent, allowing the recording to unfold without comment. What immediately stood out was not a dramatic confession or an unexpected accusation. Instead, it was the witness's careful habit of separating facts from assumptions. Whenever asked whether something had been personally observed, the witness answered directly. Whenever asked to speculate, the witness politely declined. Those distinctions had been summarized accurately months earlier, but much of their careful wording had disappeared when condensed into investigative reports. Daniel finally paused the recording. "Your Honor," he said thoughtfully, "the summary was never false. It was simply shorter than the original interview." Olivia nodded. "And in a criminal trial, shorter can sometimes mean less complete." Judge Whitmore folded her hands together. "The court's responsibility is not to decide whether anyone acted improperly simply because a summary omitted context. The responsibility is to determine whether the jury should hear the complete context before reaching a verdict." Neither attorney disagreed. The discussion remained professional because everyone understood that administrative efficiency and intentional misconduct were not the same thing. The issue before the court concerned completeness, not blame. The recording continued. Several minutes later, another exchange captured everyone's attention. The interviewer asked whether the witness had ever been entirely certain about the sequence of two events occurring only minutes apart. The witness answered with remarkable honesty. "I can tell you what I personally saw. I cannot tell you what happened outside my view." Daniel quietly circled the sentence in his transcript. Olivia did the same. Both recognized that the distinction could influence how later testimony was interpreted without necessarily changing the underlying evidence itself. Judge Whitmore looked toward the clerk. "Please mark that section for further review after the hearing resumes." The clerk acknowledged the instruction and entered the time stamp into the record. Outside the courtroom, Marcus Reed remained seated on the familiar wooden bench. Evening light now stretched across the courthouse lobby, turning the polished marble floor a warm shade of gold. A courthouse security officer walking toward the exit slowed when he recognized Marcus. "Still here?" he asked with a friendly smile. Marcus returned the smile. "Yes, sir. Long day. Worth finishing." The officer nodded. "Safe answer." Marcus laughed quietly. "Honest answer." The brief conversation ended as naturally as it had begun. Marcus looked toward the closed courtroom doors once again. He still had no idea what the recording contained. He knew only that he had promised to deliver the envelope and remain available if the court needed him. Keeping that promise no longer felt like a burden. It felt like the final step in someone else's unfinished responsibility. Back inside chambers, the recording reached its conclusion. Silence filled the room for several seconds before Judge Whitmore spoke. "The court has now confirmed that the certified transcript accurately reflects the original recording." She looked first to Daniel Brooks and then to Olivia Carter. "Based upon what we have reviewed, I intend to reconvene the proceedings outside the presence of the jury for additional argument regarding how these materials should be addressed under the rules of evidence." Daniel closed his notebook slowly. "The state is prepared to proceed." Olivia gathered her papers with equal care. "The defense is prepared as well." Judge Whitmore rose from her chair, but before leaving the conference room, she paused for a brief moment. Earlier that morning, she had viewed Marcus Reed as an unexpected interruption to an already demanding trial. Now, after hours of careful review, she realized something that stayed with her far more than the recovered documents themselves. The quiet man waiting patiently outside had never asked the court to believe him. He had simply trusted the court to do what it was created to do once the complete record was finally placed before it. When Courtroom 5B reconvened, the jury remained in the assembly room while Judge Eleanor Whitmore resumed the proceedings with only counsel, the clerk, the bailiff, and the court reporter present. The atmosphere was calm, deliberate, and noticeably different from the hurried rhythm that had filled the courtroom earlier that morning. Every participant now understood that the next decisions would shape not only the direction of the trial, but also the confidence that every relevant piece of evidence had been handled with fairness. Judge Whitmore adjusted the papers before her and spoke with measured clarity. "The court has completed its preliminary review of the recovered materials. The original recording, the certified transcript, and the accompanying documentation appear to have entered the judicial records system through proper administrative procedures. The issue before this court is not whether these materials exist. The issue is determining the legally appropriate method for addressing them before the jury hears any additional testimony." Daniel Brooks stood first. "Your Honor, after reviewing the recovered transcript and recording, the state believes additional proceedings outside the presence of the jury are necessary before the trial continues. The newly recovered materials do not automatically change the facts already presented, but they provide original context that should be evaluated under the applicable rules of evidence." Olivia Carter rose immediately afterward. "The defense agrees with that position. Both parties deserve the opportunity to address the complete record before asking the jury to reach a final conclusion." Judge Whitmore appreciated that neither attorney attempted to gain a strategic advantage from the unexpected discovery. Instead, they had chosen the slower path, the one that protected the integrity of the process itself. She turned toward the bailiff. "Please ask Mr. Marcus Reed to enter the courtroom." The request carried no urgency, only respect. Moments later, the courtroom doors opened quietly. Marcus stepped inside wearing the same navy work jacket he had worn since morning. He paused near the rear of the courtroom until the bailiff indicated where he should stand. Judge Whitmore looked directly at him for the first time since ordering him to leave hours earlier. "Mr. Reed," she said, "thank you for remaining available." Marcus inclined his head. "Yes, Your Honor. The court has confirmed that you delivered the envelope only after it completed official processing through the records office." "Yes, Your Honor." "Did you open it at any point?" "No, Your Honor." "Did anyone ask you to alter, remove, or inspect its contents?" "No, Your Honor." His answers remained exactly as concise as they had been throughout the day. Judge Whitmore studied him for a brief moment before asking one final question. "Why did you stay after you were instructed to leave the courtroom?" Marcus answered without hesitation. Because the bailiff asked me to remain available if the court needed me later, and because I believe the envelope belonged here more than it belonged with me. No one spoke for several seconds. The simplicity of his answer carried more weight than a lengthy explanation could have. Daniel Brooks quietly closed his notebook. Olivia Carter lowered her pen. Even the court reporter briefly looked up before continuing to transcribe every word. Judge Whitmore folded her hands together. Mr. Reed, the court appreciates your cooperation today. Marcus nodded politely. Thank you, Your Honor. He expected to be excused again, but instead the judge addressed everyone present. The events of today demonstrate why courts rely upon complete records rather than assumptions. Procedures exist to protect every person who enters this courtroom, and when previously unavailable material is properly recovered, the court has an obligation to consider it carefully, regardless of how inconvenient that process may be. As Marcus quietly stepped back toward the rear of the courtroom, Judge Whitmore realized that the greatest lesson of the day had not come from the recovered transcript or the sealed envelope. It had come from the steady patience of an ordinary citizen who never demanded recognition, never challenged the authority of the court, and never stopped believing that if every person fulfilled their responsibility with honesty, the truth would eventually find its rightful place. The jury returned to courtroom 5B just before the courthouse clock struck 5 in the afternoon. Outside the tall windows, the last light of a November day settled across downtown Columbus, casting long reflections over the polished marble floors. The room was quiet, not because anyone expected a dramatic ending, but because every person present understood that careful decisions often carried the greatest weight. Judge Eleanor Whitmore looked toward the jurors before addressing the courtroom. Members of the jury, she began. During the recess, the court addressed a procedural matter involving official records that were recently recovered through the court's administrative process. Before this trial continues, both parties will receive additional time to review those materials in accordance with the rules of evidence. This decision is not intended to favor either side. It is intended to ensure that your verdict, whatever it may ultimately be, is based upon the most complete record the law permits. No one objected. Daniel Brooks stood. The state supports the court's ruling. Olivia Carter followed. The defense supports it as well. Their agreement carried unusual significance. It reminded everyone present that justice was not a contest between winning and losing. It was a shared responsibility to protect the integrity of the process. Judge Whitmore then turned toward the rear of the courtroom. Mr. Marcus Reed. Marcus stepped forward with the same calm expression he had worn throughout the day. Yes, Your Honor. The judge paused for a brief moment before speaking again. Earlier today, I instructed you to leave this courtroom because I believed you were interrupting these proceedings. Based upon everything the court has now confirmed, it is clear that you were attempting to complete a lawful delivery connected to an official court record. You complied respectfully with every instruction given to you, remained available when requested, and honored both the court's authority and your own responsibility. The court appreciates your professionalism. Marcus lowered his head slightly. Thank you, Your Honor. He did not ask for an apology. He did not mention the hours he had spent waiting. He simply accepted her words with the same quiet dignity that had guided him all day. Judge Whitmore continued, her voice measured and sincere. Every person who enters this courtroom deserves to be treated with fairness. Today reminds all of us, including the court, that first, impressions should never replace careful attention to the facts. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Even the reporters chose not to write immediately. Some moments deserved to be experienced before they were recorded. As the hearing concluded, the bailiff opened the courtroom doors. Attorneys gathered their files. Jurors were escorted out according to normal procedure. The clerk secured the recovered transcript, the original recording, and the envelope inside the evidence cabinet under the court's supervision. Nothing extraordinary happened after that. No applause filled the room. No sudden celebration interrupted the ordinary rhythm of the courthouse. Marcus thanked the bailiff, nodded politely to Olivia Carter and Daniel Brooks, and walked toward the front entrance carrying nothing in his hands. His responsibility had ended the moment the complete record reached the people entrusted to examine it. Outside, the cool evening air welcomed him as city buses continued their familiar routes through downtown Columbus. Across the street, one bus stopped to collect passengers beginning their trip home. Marcus smiled quietly. Tomorrow he would return to driving his own route, greeting strangers, keeping his schedule, and helping people reach their destinations. Most of them would never know what had happened inside the courthouse that afternoon. They did not need to. Some of the most meaningful acts of integrity were never witnessed by crowds. Judge Whitmore remained alone in the courtroom for a final moment before leaving. Her eyes rested briefly on the now empty evidence table where the brown envelope had first been placed. Hours earlier, she had seen only an interruption. By the end of the day, she understood it had been a reminder. Justice is strongest when it is willing to slow down, reconsider, and make room for the complete truth. Marcus had not changed the law. He had not sought recognition. He had simply kept a promise, trusted the process, and treated every person with respect, even when respect had not immediately been returned. As the courthouse lights dimmed and another ordinary workday came to a close, one quiet lesson remained behind. Kindness is strength. Justice restores dignity. People can change. If this story meant something to you, subscribe to Narralight for more powerful stories that remind us to look beyond appearances, challenge prejudice, and never underestimate the impact of doing what's right. Because sometimes, the smallest act of courage creates the biggest change. Thank you for watching. Remember, the world changes one choice at a time. We'll see you in the next story.